Hello and welcome back to World 360. What is the tiny island nation that has cut ties with Taiwan and returned to China's camp? India's trade deficit with China seems to have modestly declined, but are the numbers only telling one side of the story? And lastly, is South Africa's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice turning into an epic legal battle between the global South and the global North? We answer this and more in today's episode. So first up, Nauru. Nauru is a tiny island nation in Micronesia, which is located just northeast of Australia. It has a population of just 12,000 people, which is equal to that of Delhi's Lajpat Nagar. But this small country made headlines this week after it severed ties with Taiwan and returned to China's camp. On Monday, the Nauru government posted an announcement on its official Facebook page saying it recognizes the People's Republic of China. Soon after that, it broke relations with Taiwan. Something similar happened in 2002 when Nauru shifted from diplomatic alignment with Taiwan to China. It again restored relations with Taiwan in 2005, and the latest switch to China comes after the recently held Taiwan elections in which an anti-China candidate, William Lai, got a resounding victory. But these developments aside, let's look at the intriguing history of this little island nation. In 1968, Nauru established independence and became the world's smallest independent republic. But the decades before that were marked by the small nation being under the control of several world powers. For starters, in the late 1800s, Nauru was under the control of Germany. After World War I, the League of Nations handed it over to Australia, Britain, and New Zealand to govern, though Australia had the heavier hand of control out of the three. Despite being located far from the action, the small island nation was also roped into World War II. In fact, it was the only territory in South Pacific to face Nazi military action during World War II. It wasn't long before the Japanese occupied the island and even set up a military post. Now, this little island nation was also strategically significant due to its large deposits of a special mineral, which is phosphate. Now, phosphate is a key ingredient for fertilizers, and almost all global powers that occupied Nauru during its pre-independent history exploited its phosphate deposits to prop up their own agricultural sectors. But today, Nauru's phosphate reserves are practically non-existent. In 1899, Australian geologist Albert Ellis noted that 80% of the entire island was rich in phosphate of lime. But today, Nauru's phosphate deposits have been mined to depletion, mainly by its neighbors Australia and New Zealand, who use the mineral to push their own economic growth. Today, Nauru does not even feature in the top 5 phosphate suppliers, which include Morocco, China, Egypt, Algeria, and South Africa. And all of this after at one point Nauru being home to one of the world's biggest reserves of this mineral. For our second topic, we're looking at statistics that don't always tell you the whole story. To illustrate this, we're going to look at some interesting data from the Chinese government on its trade with the rest of the world for 2023. Keep in mind that this data pertains to January to December 2023, the calendar year, and not the April to March financial year that we in India follow. Now, earlier this week, China released its trade data for the month of December 2023. This showed that India's trade deficit with China has fallen shy of $100 billion, which was actually the mark that was breached last year. And by last year, I mean 2022. A trade deficit usually arises when a country imports more than it exports. According to the data from the Chinese government, China's exports to India stood at $117.6 billion, while its imports from India stood at about $18.53 billion, ultimately culminating in a $99 billion trade deficit that India has with China. This could be viewed as a modest decline in India's trade deficit with China, which had actually ballooned to $101 billion in the calendar year 2022, and began a hot topic of contention in India actually, given the ongoing border conflict along the line of actual control. Many analysts had questioned why India continues to have a robust trade relationship with China despite having a border standoff, and you may think that this recent decline in the trade deficit may quell their concerns. However, there's a larger story behind the numbers, and let's get into it. If we zoom out for a second, the data shows that China's exports to the entire world have seen a decline, about 4.6% to be precise. Meanwhile, China's total imports also saw a fall of 5.5% year-on-year. Now, these may seem like small single-digit percentages, but as a major manufacturing hub of the world, which is entrenched in almost all supply chains and sectors of the world economy, any changes or patterns in the Chinese economy can certainly have ripple effects on the rest of the world. Just a few weeks ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping had admitted on New Year's Eve that headwinds are facing the Chinese economy, unemployment, and an economic slowdown. In fact, the quarter of July to September 2023 was when China registered its first deficit in foreign direct investment, or FDI. Fears of domestic capital flight by Chinese households and private investors have also been looming. And therefore, it is very possible that these larger patterns affected China's drop in exports to India, which dipped about 1.3% year-on-year. Sure, Indian exports to China rose 4.6%, but economists who spoke to ThePrint also argue that India's overall merchandise trade has contracted this year. More so, many Indian exports still heavily rely on Chinese raw materials, so it isn't as though this is an indication that India is becoming less dependent on the Chinese economy. In fact, it's also possible that fluctuation in the dollar could have also affected foreign exchange used in goods trade between India and China. In terms of sheer volume, India's exports to China are still about roughly 1/10 of Chinese exports to India. India has rolled out the PLI scheme, which aims to boost domestic manufacturing by providing financial incentives to homegrown companies. But that's yet to bear fruit on a large scale, mainly because investments themselves also have a gestation time. It is also not a guarantee that because the Chinese calendar year data shows a trade deficit just shy of $100 billion, that the same will be reflected at the end of the Indian financial year in March. This is because payments against past trade are realized towards the end of the Indian financial year, and the dynamics of yearly export-import gap may change due to that. Therefore, we may have to hold our breath until the end of March this year. For our final topic, we're looking at how South Africa's case against Israel is exposing divisions in the international community, especially between the global north and the global south. Just to recap, last week, the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, which is a UN top court, heard South Africa's case against Israel, in which it argued that Israel's actions in Gaza has violated the United Nations 1948 Genocide Convention. Keep in mind that this convention was established in the wake of the Holocaust after the World War II. Now, this is an extremely serious case in which South Africa has leveled accusations of genocide against Israel and called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Israel had later presented its arguments before the ICJ, arguing that attacks on Gaza have been directed at Hamas command centers, which it claims are located under public buildings like hospitals. Now, what's interesting about this case is what's happening outside the courtroom. It's very telling to see which countries have supported South Africa and which countries have supported Israel. For South Africa, countries like Malaysia, Turkey, Jordan, Pakistan, Bolivia, Colombia, and Brazil have voiced support. All of these are developing countries. India, however, is yet to issue a statement on this matter. Now, when we look at which countries are backing Israel, it's mostly developed nations in the West like Germany, Canada, the US, the UK, and some have even questioned whether the ICJ has jurisdiction over complaints brought forth by South Africa. Analysts say the case is exposing cracks in international law and the divide between developed and developing countries. Legal scholars who have exposed international law's complicity in colonialism will be watching South Africa versus Israel to reflect on the question whether international law can ever be decolonized, said Nimer Sultani, Palestinian author and reader in public law at SOAS, University of London. Guardian columnist Nasreen Malik also argued in a recent op-ed that South Africa is testing the West's claim to moral superiority. Let's not forget that just last year, a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza was blocked by a US veto. Therefore, this case isn't just about South Africa simply acting on its long-standing relations with Palestine, though that is definitely a factor. However, this case is also a test of multilateralism. At a time when many countries, including India, have seemed to have lost faith in global institutions and are desperately trying to reform it. You take the UNSC, you take other bodies across the world. These are all being put under the scanner. It was only last year that the African Union, or the AU, was given a seat at the G20 after years of other international groups like the European Union enjoying presence in the bloc. When the ICJ may provide its judgment is anyone's guess. Some cases at the ICJ have been in trial for years, like the 2019 case between Gambia and Myanmar, which is still ongoing. Thank you so much for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint.